Due Process, winner of 12 New York and Mid-Atlantic Emmys, including the 2008 award for Best Discussion Series.
And I will raise you up.
It began with a repeat pedophile, a 7-year-old victim, a murder rape that horrified New Jersey. And it made new law across this country. But now a federally funded study says that Megan's Law doesn't deliver. Is it time to make a change? That's next on this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy.
One family's grief, a state's outrage, a governor and legislature determined to do something. I'm Sandra King, and 15 years ago, it all added up to landmark legislation to tighten the grip on released sex offenders in this state and across the country. But a federally funded study of Megan's Law is now raising serious questions about whether the law has been successful here in New Jersey and whether it's worth keeping. We'll get reaction from a former congressman who was among the law's most vigorous supporters and an ACLU lawyer who opposed it from the start. In fact, for a decade and a half, there's been one court challenge after another, nearly all of those based on civil rights claims, from privacy to double jeopardy. But this report is something different. It makes no mention of the fairness or even the legality of Megan's Law. Instead, it's just the numbers, the cold data, that suggests the law may not have lived up to the expectations at the start.
What they can do is lock them up and throw away the key. But they're not doing that. So if they're not going to do that, at least let us know who they are so we can watch them.
That's what Megan's mother told us 14 years ago, just after the law was passed. The idea, she said, was to keep tabs on sexual predators. And who could blame her given the way her daughter died? At the hands of a neighbor, a twice-convicted sex offender who lured the 7-year-old across the street to this house where he raped and killed her.
He raped and murdered my daughter, and he has more rights than she did. Where were her rights? She's dead.
Where the house once stood, a park was built in Megan Kanka's memory. And in her name, with a governor leading the charge, that law was passed first in New Jersey and then in all 50 states to keep track of sexual predators and, depending on the severity of their crimes, to notify not just police,
Could have a seat,
but schools, places where children gather, even neighbors of where they are once they're out.
Tier 1 normally is just police. It's notification to law enforcement agency where the offender is going to reside. Tier 2 may involve like daycare centers or maybe schools. Tier 3, prosecutor's office will contact us. Listen, we got this guy tiered, we got the papers from the court, we need to set up a date to do the community notification.
So offices like this one in Newark are active throughout the state, throughout the country, to register and keep track of released offenders, and for those deemed most dangerous,
The police, Megan's Law Unit, Detective Aviles are going to help you.
to warn the community they are there, door to door.
If you know there's a guy like that living in your neighborhood, no, remember, you can't go around here. I want to make sure you're going where you're going. You know, you'll supervise your kids a little bit more.
It's a law that has required and created its own costly bureaucracy based on the assumption that it can cut down on sex assaults.
So basically, you're doing an address change and re-registering, right?
Especially against children.
It does help to know. I'm not going over to anybody's house and picketing or anything, but it's nice to know where people are.
I check. I check my neighborhood.
It's the government looking over you again, but yeah, a little bit of government doesn't hurt.
But now a federally funded study by New Jersey Corrections, with help from Rutgers, has arrived at a startling conclusion: that Megan's Law may not work. According to the study, despite wide community support, there is little evidence that Megan's Law is effective in reducing either new first-time sex offense or sexual reoffenses.
Perhaps the legislature should hold hearings and see what's wrong with the law.
If Megan's Law is not the one that's going to do it, we have to find other ways to do it.
If I had somebody living next door to me that committed such a crime, I would want to know.
Those comments from an unscientific survey on the streets of Newark. But there hasn't been much official reaction to challenges like this one raised in the report. Should future studies establish that Megan's Law has no demonstrable effect, policymakers and legislative leaders should investigate other options for lowering sex offense rates.
Missing persons, you know, if it's a missing child somewhere, I say, all right, how many sex offenders do you have in that area? Do you have any sex offenders in that area? And he'll point them out, point the area where they may be at. And it's very helpful.
And then there's the matter of bang for the buck, which is also raised in the report. Administering Megan's Law, tracking sex offenders, notifying communities, is said to cost more than $5 million a year. Mrs. Kanka, who refused our invitation for an interview, reportedly told the Star-Ledger that the cost of Megan's Law is, quote, pennies compared to other state spending. And in an email she told us, I don't feel Megan's Law needs defending on this front. Dick can do what needs to be done. Dick being former Congressman Dick Zimmer, who wrote the federal Megan's Law. He's here, as is the ACLU legal director, who opposes the law. So stay with us.
I don't think you should get rid of it. You got to protect the children, you got to protect the public.
I think they just need to make the neighborhoods more alert when there are sex offenders in the area.
You pillory them in front of the whole town that they're a sex offender.
I agree there's injustice done very, very often, but sometimes you have to give a little to get a little.
Because you never know. You could have a pedophile sitting next door playing with your kids.
I don't think that it would reduce sex crimes because I don't think it's a deterrent.
You shouldn't get rid of it, just revamp it, make it stronger, act on it.
Ask about Megan's Law and everyone's got an opinion. But for our two guests, those opinions go back 15 years. Dick Zimmer was the congressman from the district where Megan Kanka lived and died. He wrote the federal version of Megan's Law. And Ed Barocas is now legal director of the ACLU of New Jersey. But when Megan's Law was first put on the books, he was with the Public Defender's Office, mounting legal challenges to Megan's Law. So Ed, let me start with you. You saw this report. What was your reaction?
It was not a surprise. For 15 years, this has been the information that we've had. 15 years ago, when we brought the challenges, we not only brought it based on civil rights issues, constitutional issues, but on the fact that it would not work, and the state needed to be put to its proofs.
Would not work because?
Well, for a number of reasons. And we had victims' rights groups as well as treatment providers coming forth and saying this won't work because, for a few reasons. Number one, the actual notification would not stop the ardent sex offenders who are simply going to go to the next town over. Also, the loss of housing and employment could actually prompt people because it impedes their reintegration. It actually impedes rehabilitation. And third, it does not capture most sex offenses because most offenses are not reported and most occur within the home. So Megan's Law doesn't really attack what needs to be attacked when we talk about what policy we're going to adopt to stop sex offenses. We all want to reduce the number of sex offenses. The question is how.
Dick, when Ed talks about not working, the first thing on that list he gave us was, I think, referring to the failure to prevent future offenses. Was that your standard? And do you accept that this report has said if that's your standard, it doesn't work?
My standard and the standard of the Kankas was to arm families with the knowledge of where a sexual predator is and allow them to protect themselves and their children. There's no question in my mind that if Megan Kanka had been informed that somebody who lived across the street from her was dangerous and could hurt her, she would not have gone there. And there's nothing in this study measuring whether people who are made aware of the presence of a sexual predator are safer as a result.
Well,
they measure a lot of other. They measure a lot. Yeah, it's hard to measure, but that's the crux of the legislation. Now, we never claimed that it would do away with sex crimes. We never even claimed that it would reduce the incidence of sex crimes. But this study does show that there was a steep decrease in sex crimes after the enactment of Megan's Law.
The study also says, however,
that the study says that there was no decrease in first offenses, which of course by definition aren't covered by notification, and there was no.
But presumably there could be a deterrent effect.
Well, which is, and if there were, that would be nice. But and the other conclusion that they reached was that there was no impact on recidivism, but. They never went to in the study, they didn't get the necessary data that allowed them to actually measure the recidivism by people who were truly subject to community notification, because most of the people who register under Megan's Law aren't known by their neighbors because they're in either Tier 1 or Tier 2. And they're either, the community isn't notified at all, or only public school principals and select personnel.
So does Megan's Law not go far enough? Should there be more community notification?
There should be community notification of those people who pose the greatest risk.
So you're satisfied with the way it's implemented now?
Well, I think, this goes to the final part of the study. I think there's far too much bureaucracy and litigation involved in the implementation, which makes it expensive for the taxpayers. But the general focus and the general way that it's implemented, I think, is the way that we envisioned it.
We'll get back to the money question, because that's one of the things that this study raises. But do you see it as a flawed study, Ed?
You know, I think the study is very clear in its conclusions that there's no evidence that it reduces sexual offenses, either first-time offenses or recidivist offenses, and importantly, it fails to reduce the number of victims. And I hear what Dick has been saying about what the intention of Megan's Law was, but shouldn't the intention be to reduce the number of sex offenses, both first-time offenses and future offenses by recidivists?
That's what society should do, and that's what government should do, and that's what, in fact, the Kankas have done by creating this Megan Nicole Kanka Foundation, which educates families across the board about how to recognize the risk of sexual offenses and prepare yourself to deal with them. It's more than just notification. But notification is an essential and common sense element of any effort to allow people to protect themselves from these predators.
Okay, let me just jump in here for a minute, because you've told me that the federal law, which you wrote, does not say this is the reason we're doing it, to prevent recidivism. But our statute says that the idea is to impact the danger of recidivism posed by sex offenders.
Well,
so there's very much a cause and effect here, and I think the study says, your cause hasn't brought the effect you expected.
What the statute said and what the Supreme Court of New Jersey relied upon in upholding its constitutionality was the reason you pick sex offenders as being subject to this unusual notification requirement is because some of them do pose a very serious risk of recidivism. That's why this law is justified. The law was not designed per se to reduce recidivism. It was caused by the fact of recidivism.
But it's one thing to say we have an interest in protecting against sex offenses. Of course we do. The question is, does this further that interest? And getting aside from the legal issues now, it's a policy issue. And what are we, I think it's time that we stopped, especially now that we have facts that show that this does not impact those recidivism rates.
I wouldn't say these are facts that show that.
I think it's time that we stop that legislators.
Inconclusive report.
I think it's time that legislators stop waving their fists in the air while keeping their heads in the sand. If we actually want to stop, reduce the number of sex offenses, we can't have quick fix ad hoc measures. And you know, with all respect to what you've done since that time, that's what our state legislature has done, and that's what municipalities have done. These quick fix, feel-good measures. What needs to happen, there are at least three things that need to happen. One is we need, you know, we're talking about $5 million here a year. Where that would be better spent would be on victim services, to make it easier for victims to come forward and to be able to actually be part of the criminal justice system, to carry through and help prosecutors convict. Because, and there are examples like Winona's House in Essex County that do that, that bring organizations together to make it easier for victims. Because as you said, Megan's Law does not address first-time offenses, and most offenses are not reported.
I agree with you, except I don't think that the money should be pulled. I don't think Megan's Law should be repealed and this should be done in its place. We can have.
You'd say spend the money.
We can save money with a more streamlined implementation of Megan's Law, but victim services are absolutely essential.
Well, that's one, and
I agree with you 100%.
Yeah, and there are two more things. Number two, if society really believes that sex offenders, repeat sex offenders, should be having longer prison terms or 3 strikes and you're in laws, then pass them. Don't set the sex offenders up to be released and then set up for failure.
I agree with you on that too.
Before we leave this money question, it seemed to me that when Megan Kanka said, you know, you're talking pennies here when you're talking $5 million.
If it were essential to spend it, I would say spend it.
Are you offended, as she seemed to be, by the idea that one of the things that this study says is, hey, this is money that perhaps is being spent unwisely?
It says if future studies show that there's no impact, and it does not, as that implies, conclude that there's no impact. It says if future studies show that there's no impact.
Well, it does say that there's no impact.
No, it says...
Then it talks about the money separately, but it does say, despite wide community support for these laws, there's little evidence to date, including this study, to support a claim that Megan's Law is effective in reducing either first-time sex offenses or sexual reoffenses.
Finish your sentence.
Yes, so I finished it.
But there is evidence that they have a hard time refuting that it reduces the overall rate of sex offenses. And go back to the report and look at the language.
Actually, they say that they doubt that it is reducing, but
they
do raise this question about the numbers.
The rate went down steeply starting in 1994, which was the year Megan's Law was enacted, and continued to go down steeply.
So you say there's a cause and effect? What do you say?
No, I'm not. I'm saying that there's no other argument that I can think of or that they can think of, the authors of the report. But despite that all, what I'm telling you is that the purpose of Megan's Law was to protect potential victims and give them the necessary information, and the potential victim, the potential Megan Kanka, we can't identify who she is. But I do believe, I have a 7-year-old granddaughter, and I know that when her parents have the information about the whereabouts of a violent sex offender, they will make sure, and she will have the judgment as a 7-year-old to stay away from him.
But let me return to my question, which is, are you offended by the idea that the $5 million would be something that is raised in determining whether Megan's Law is something that perhaps we should think about scrapping?
Well, if it were ineffective, then any amount of money would be too much. This is not a conclusive study about its effectiveness. Certainly, they didn't even try to measure the effectiveness by the standard that guided me and most of the proponents of the legislation from the outset. So this study, which is at best inconclusive, measuring criteria that we never asked to be measured by, that we never claimed that we could have an impact on, that doesn't justify abandoning the program, which I believe has saved lives, hundreds of lives all around the country. You don't know who those children are or who those other victims are.
In fairness, though, that's a guess. Yeah? I mean, you don't...
I would just ask your viewers to conclude, to just think about it in common sense terms. And the fact is this information is out there about the most dangerous sex offenders. Our Internet Sex Offense Registry in New Jersey has been contacted more than 6 million times. So people are using this information, and they're not using it, as was predicted by the ACLU and the public defender, to harass the offenders, but rather to protect their families.
Which I think, Dick, is an important point. And let me move past where we are and ask you, what about that? That was the prediction, and does it happen?
Well, it did happen, especially at the beginning of Megan's Law.
But what about now?
It did happen.
Things have sort of worked themselves out?
Absolutely. Now it has become more of a policy question. And you raise the issue of common sense. I think it was Albert Einstein who says common sense needs constant reappraisal. And when you have facts that go against what your assumptions were, we should be accepting the facts. And it's important to point out this study was not by the Public Defender's Office or the Public Advocate's Office or by treatment organizations. It was by the Department of Corrections and by Dr. Philip Witt, who helped the Attorney General set up Megan's Law. And it's consistent with a Washington state study that was done in 2006 that also found that there's no evidence that notification reduces the number of sexual offenses. That's what we should be focused on, protecting the children, protecting the women, reducing the number of sexual offenses. I mentioned 2 things that could be done. The third thing is, most importantly, is not to have the quick fixes, but rather get everyone together. Get a task force of everyone that has information on this. So we don't, yes, it will take more time, but let's get it right. Get the victims groups, get the treatment providers, get the prosecutors, the public defenders, the Department of Corrections who handles the parole for life matters. Get them to, and let's figure out what are the problems that we can address and how can we best implement that.
We've got 3 minutes left, so I want to ask Ed whether you think, as the Congressman has said, the legal matters have been decided. Does this change anything? Does this give you grounds to go back to the Supreme Court and say, wait a minute?
Well, both the New Jersey Supreme Court and the Third Circuit Court, the federal court, in part did rely on assumptions that notification actually would further the interest. To some extent, though, especially because of the U.S. Supreme Court decision in the Alaska case, to some extent we're beyond that, although I wouldn't say completely, because we continue to have these quick fix measures passed by the state and by municipalities.
Does the study open the door to challenging Megan's Law here in New Jersey?
I think with the Alaska decision in the U.S. Supreme Court, I think it would be hard to go back. But let me say, that's not my biggest concern right now. But my biggest concern is that if we're going to do something, we get it right. We saw one of the quick fixes that was part of Megan's Law was community supervision for life. While you would think a good idea, put these people on parole for life, what the ultimate result is that other states that normally accept our sex offenders who are on probation and parole are returning the sex offenders when they're done because they don't have community supervision for life.
You've raised another interesting Megan's Law question, and we've got 90 seconds. So, Dick, tell me, you've pointed out some apparent contradictions in the study, but the study does come to some very firm conclusions. Is there going to be fallout from this that's going to affect Megan's Law going forward?
I don't think so. Governor Corzine, who is quite liberal on matters such as this, who was very happy to help repeal the death penalty in New Jersey, for instance,
another area that you were involved in,
has said that he has no intention of changing Megan's Law as a result of this study. And I don't see any action in any other states. The last time this came up in Congress, a very sweeping addition to Megan's Law was passed called the Adam Walsh Act, which passed without a single dissenting vote in either house.
With 30 seconds left, Ed, your prediction, Congressman doesn't think that we're going to see any changes, do you?
Well, I would hope, whether or not this particular law gets changed, that we actually focus moving forward on actually getting to the heart of the problem and addressing that rather than ending up with feel-good quick fixes.
Well, I hope we'll come back and talk about it again with our thanks to Ed Barocas. And Dick Simmer, that's it for this edition of Due Process. But we'll be back next week with more on law and justice. Till then, for Raymond, who is off today, for Henrietta Parker, whom we need back here with us, and for all of us here at Due Process, I'm Sandra King. Thanks for watching.
Hasn't reduced it, then I don't know if you should get rid of it, but maybe do something that would be maybe more effective that would.
I think it's for the safety of the children, really. It's a good thing.
I think doing something is always better than doing nothing.
You cannot falter because something doesn't work. You just have to keep insisting.
I think maybe there are other ways to approach reducing the sex crimes, educating or early prevention.
I don't think it's gotten rid of it, but I think it's certainly cut it down.
It's very scary to look at all the sexual predators in the neighborhood. When people go online, it's like, it's unbelievable. So, I mean, we should figure out how to do it better. I mean, so I would keep it and try and make it better.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy.